Imagine you are walking down a medieval street at first light. The sun has barely peeped out between the jagged rooftops and stone towers. The air smells of smoke, freshly baked bread, and something else. An acid, piercing stench that seeps into every corner. It is not a strange smell to its inhabitants. It is the everyday aroma of a world without modern sewerage. To your left, a group of women is lining up around a well. They draw water with wooden buckets and pour it into clay pitchers. A child, barefoot and with a dirt-streaked face, approaches with a jug. The woman accompanying him offers him a drink, but not of water. It is beer. Low strength, lukewarm, with hardly any alcohol, but enough for the little one to drink it without risk. In medieval Europe, water could kill you. It was not an isolated danger, nor a popular superstition. It was a fact proven by the experience of generations. In cities like London, Paris, or Seville, the water drawn from wells and rivers was exposed to constant contamination. There was no sewer system separating wastewater from sources of consumption. In London, for example, records from the 14th century speak of repeated outbreaks of dysentery and typhoid fever, diseases transmitted by contaminated water. Urban wells were dug near homes, and latrines, when they existed, were placed against the back walls of houses. The seepage of waste was inevitable. In Paris, the situation was even more alarming. The River Seine was not only the main source of water, but also the city's general dumping ground. Tanners threw in scraps of hide and chemicals, butchers dumped blood and animal offal, and households emptied their latrines directly into the channel. The chronicle of a Parisian physician from the mid-15th century described it bluntly. The water of the Seine is thicker than clear and smells more of slaughterhouse than of river. In Seville, the Guadalquivir suffered a similar problem. Waste from slaughterhouses and tanneries accumulated in the water alongside fish, remains from the market. In hot periods, the smell was unbearable. Drinking from its waters without boiling them was almost a sentence of illness. The problem was not only visible filth. The real threat was invisible pathogens. Although no one in the Middle Ages knew about bacteria or viruses, experience had shown that drinking raw water from certain sources made people sick or killed them. And here comes the most curious paradox. In a world where people hardly knew the modern concept of personal hygiene, an effective measure had developed to avoid poisonings: drinking alcohol at all hours. We are not talking about constant drunkenness. Most of the population consumed wine or low-strength beer. The fermentation process, combined with the alcohol content, eliminated much of the bacteria that thrived in water. In Northern Europe, beer was the everyday drink par excellence. There was even a version called small beer, with barely 2 or 3 degrees of alcohol, intended for daily consumption, including children. It was nutritious, provided calories, and above all, was much safer than water. In the South, wine fulfilled that role. The Mediterranean regions, with their winemaking tradition, produced enormous quantities of wine that were consumed diluted with water. Water that, by itself, was not drunk with confidence. Even monastic orders, such as the Benedictines and Cistercians, maintained internal rules that stipulated a daily ration of wine for each member of the community. Monasteries played a crucial role in the production of safe beverages. Their knowledge of fermentation, care of containers, and quality control allowed them to make beer and wine not only for their own consumption, but also to sell to nearby populations. In fact, in many villages and towns, the cleanest drink available came from monastic cellars. The figures are revealing. An adult in medieval England could consume between 1 and 2 liters of light beer a day. In some areas of northern France, the average annual wine per person exceeded 200 liters. It was not a hedonistic indulgence, but a habit of survival. This massive consumption left a mark on culture. Toasts, taverns, local festivities with beer or wine as protagonists were not only social events, they were part of an improvised health system. A system that, unknowingly, was saving thousands of lives by preventing people from drinking contaminated water. But this custom also had side effects. The continuous consumption of alcohol, although light, altered people's tolerance and in some cases contributed to a certain resistance to alcohol from an early age. In urban chronicles, it was not uncommon to read that even children of 5 or 6 years old drank watered-down beer during meals. In short, The choice between water and alcohol was not a matter of preference but of survival. Water was a constant risk, wine and beer a rudimentary but effective insurance. In this context, it is no exaggeration to say that, for centuries, European civilization was quite literally built on fermented beverages. In the next few minutes, we will see that this was not the only surprising custom of the Middle Ages. Because if water was dangerous, there were many other things that seem normal to us today that at that time could be deadly. Today, personal hygiene is such a basic routine that it is hard to imagine a world in which washing with water could be considered dangerous. But in late medieval Europe and much of the early modern period, bathing ceased to be a symbol of cleanliness and became a health risk. This transformation in collective mentality did not occur overnight. For much of the Middle Ages, public baths were common in many European cities. In places like Paris, Florence, or Toledo, the balnea or bathhouses were centers of social life, and not only for the elite, artisans, merchants, and even peasants traveling to the city could enjoy a hot bath for an affordable price. In the Islamic cities of Al-Andalus, hammams were an essential part of urban life. However, from the 14th century onward, something began to change. The great epidemics, especially the Black Death, radically altered ideas about health and disease. A highly influential medical theory at that time was that of miasmas. It was believed that diseases were transmitted through noxious vapors and fetid odors floating in the air. The body, when clean and warm after a bath, had open pores, and those pores, according to the belief, were true gateways for those miasmas. This fear was reflected in medical treatises and hygienic advice of the time. Some medieval doctors recommended limiting baths to a few times a year and preferring partial washing with damp cloths and perfumes rather than immersing oneself in hot water. Water, they said, could weaken the vital spirit and leave the body vulnerable. Public baths also began to be viewed with moral suspicion. Many became places associated with prostitution and gambling. Ecclesiastical authorities pointed them out as hotbeds of sin, and in some cases they were closed. This coincidence between moral condemnation and medical fear caused the custom of bathing to decline rapidly in much of Western Europe. In this context, there arose famous cases that today seem almost caricatured. The most famous is that of Louis XIV of France, the Sun King. Chronicles of his court indicate that over his lifetime, he bathed with water very few times. He preferred dry cleanliness with damp cloths and perfumes. In the sumptuous court of Versailles, the aroma did not come only from flowers and gardens. Fragrances were necessary to mask the widespread lack of bodily hygiene. But Louis XIV was not an isolated case. In the Iberian Peninsula, we find Henry IV of Castile, nicknamed by some chroniclers the Impotent. Although his sobriquet is more related to dynastic issues than to hygiene, there are testimonies that point to his reduced washing habits, something common among nobles of his time. It was not a matter of personal neglect, but of the conviction that water could be harmful to health. The difference between public and private bathing is also key to understanding this period. Medieval public baths were usually hot water, shared by men and women at certain times or in separate rooms. Over time, fear of contagion and moral stigma made them disappear in much of Christian Europe. Private baths, reserved for the elite, were more exclusive, but even in those cases, the frequency of use dropped drastically. Paradoxically, while Western Europe abandoned the habit of frequent bathing, other contemporary cultures maintained it vigorously. In the Islamic world, both in North Africa and the Middle East, hammams continued to be fundamental spaces for hygiene and social life. Islamic tradition associated physical cleanliness with spiritual purity, and the custom of regular bathing remained firm. In Japan, the culture of the ofuro, hot bath, was practiced daily, both at home and in public bathhouses, and was associated not only with hygiene, but also with relaxation and health. Even in Eastern Europe, regions such as Hungary and the Ottoman Empire preserved bathing traditions inherited from antiquity or Islamic influence. This contrast makes it clear that the prohibition or abandonment of frequent bathing was not universal, but a cultural phenomenon specific to Western Christian Europe, intensified by epidemics, erroneous medical beliefs, and moral restrictions imposed by the Church. Over time, the habit of avoiding water became so entrenched that in the 16th and 17th centuries, it was common for people, even of high rank, to consider it sufficient to change their undergarments and use perfumes to be clean. The skin was cleaned by rubbing with cloths, and the hands and face might be washed with cold water, but full contact with hot water was rare. This view began to change slowly with scientific advances in the 18th and 19th centuries, when germ theory replaced miasmas and bathing again came to be considered healthy. But for several centuries, bathing ceased to be a daily act and became something exceptional, even for kings. Thus, what seems to us today an elemental necessity was seen in late medieval and early modern Europe as a potentially dangerous luxury. And the irony is that in many cases, the very people who avoided water as if it were poison lived in cities where the air was so laden with filth that breathing was, in itself, a risk. But if personal hygiene could arouse suspicions and superstitions, what we will see next takes medieval thinking a step further. In some cases, laws were applied not only to people, but also to animals. And these, incredible as it may seem, could end up on trial. Today, the idea of seating an animal in a courtroom sounds absurd. But in medieval Europe, and well into the early modern period, it was not unusual for animals to be put on trial as if they were people. The legal conception of the time was deeply influenced by Roman law, local customs, and above all, by the religious view of the world. According to medieval mentality, any living being capable of causing harm could be considered subject to legal process, and that harm did not have to be limited to property or crops. It could include the death of a human being, the destruction of harvests, or even improper conduct according to the morals of the time. The principle was clear. Justice had to be applied exemplarily, and that included punishing the creature responsible. From our current perspective, these proceedings made no sense because an animal does not possess moral intent. But for medieval judges and communities, punishment served a symbolic function, to demonstrate that the law was applied without exceptions, and at the same time, to purify the place of the crime. One of the most famous cases occurred in Falaise, France, in the 15th century. A pig was accused of killing a small child. The process was recorded in the municipal archives and describes in detail each stage. The animal was arrested, brought before a court, and defended by a lawyer appointed by the court itself. The verdict was guilty, and the pig was condemned to be hanged in the public square, dressed in human clothes to symbolize its responsibility as if it were a criminal. This act was not only a form of punishment, but also a spectacle for the community. The public execution served to reaffirm the social order and the authority of the law. But not only large domestic animals were judged. In Switzerland, during the 16th century, there is a curious record. A colony of mice was formally summoned to leave a field of crops they were devastating. The court issued a document granting them a deadline to depart without harm or damage. Naturally, the mice did not appear at the hearing. The act was symbolic, but it had a theological background. It sought to give the community the sense that even pests faced legal authority, and if they did not obey, excommunication was invoked, expelling them by religious rites. In Italy, a case was recorded in the 17th century in which a horse was hanged after killing its master with a kick. As in other animal trials, the procedure included the presence of a defense lawyer and the solemn reading of the sentence. The public punishment was intended, according to the mentality of the time, to prevent future incidents and restore the harmony disrupted by the crime. These proceedings followed a formal protocol. The accused animal was detained and, if possible, confined until the day of trial. It was assigned a defense lawyer, yes, literally a human charged with arguing on its behalf, and a public hearing was held. Evidence was presented before judges and notaries, just as in a human trial. The sentence was read aloud, and if the verdict was guilty, the punishment was applied publicly and ceremonially. The foundation of these practices was deeply tied to the religious beliefs of the time. In the medieval Christian view, evil was not exclusive to the human being. It could inhabit any creature. In some cases, animals were seen as instruments of the devil or as divine punishments sent to test the community. Trying and punishing them was, symbolically, a way to fight evil and protect the population. It is important to understand that these trials also had a social function. Medieval justice was not limited to resolving conflicts. It was a public act of reaffirming order. The spectacle of seeing an animal on the gallows or a notary reading a sentence against a group of mice sought not only to punish, but also to reinforce the authority of those who governed and of the church that legitimized that power. Although it may seem a strictly medieval phenomenon, animal trials persisted much longer than we imagine. In France, even in the 18th century, there are records of proceedings against bulls, horses, and even insects. One of the last known cases occurred in 1750, when a donkey and several men were accused of a sexual crime against nature. The donkey was acquitted after witnesses testified that it was an honest animal and a victim of the situation, while the men were condemned. Today, these trials seem absurd to us, but at the time they were part of a worldview where the symbolic and the legal were intertwined. Punishing an animal was not in fact an attempt at rehabilitation, but a ritual act that reinforced social cohesion and the belief that no harmful act went unanswered. Thus, the history of these trials reminds us that justice has not always been guided by modern reason, but by a web of beliefs, fears, and symbols that, although they may seem strange to us today, were fundamental to the organization of medieval societies. In the next section, we will see that medieval laws and taxes could be as unusual as these sentences, and that at times, a simple tax could light the fuse of a rebellion. In medieval Europe, taxes were not just a matter of raising money. They were a direct reflection of social hierarchy, the power of the nobility, and in many cases, the ingenuity or greed of those who governed. Some levies may seem absurd to us today, but in their time they profoundly marked daily life, even provoking armed uprisings. One of the most famous was the gabelle, the salt tax in France. Salt was an essential good. It was used not only to season food, but above all to preserve it. In an age without refrigeration, salt was the key to storing meat, fish, or even vegetables for months. Therefore, taxing it meant controlling a vital resource. The gabelle was established in the 14th century and soon became one of the most hated taxes in the kingdom. It was not only expensive, but strictly regulated. The law required each family to buy a minimum amount of salt per year, even if they did not need it. This created a very active black market. Smugglers, known as faux sauniers, transported salt from regions exempt from the tax to areas where the gabelle was mandatory. The persecution against them was relentless, and many were condemned to the galleys or even executed. Popular discontent over the gabelle flared up several times. One of the most notorious revolts was the Salt Revolt of 1548 in southwestern France, where peasants and merchants rose up against the tax collectors. The rebellion was harshly suppressed, but the gabelle did not disappear. It lasted until the French Revolution, an eternal symbol of the fiscal oppression of the Ancien Régime. Another peculiar levy was the mill toll, common throughout much of feudal Europe. Under this system, peasants were obliged to grind their grain exclusively at the lord's mill, paying for each sack of flour. By law, they could not install their own mill or go to one in another locality. This turned the mill into a steady source of income for the lord, but also into a symbol of his absolute control over the local economy. At times, this monopoly provoked extreme tensions. If the mill was in poor condition or ran slowly, peasants were forced to wait days to grind their grain, wasting time and risking spoilage. Some tried to evade the levy by grinding in secret with handstones, but if they were discovered, they could be fined or physically punished. Later, already in the early modern period, equally unusual taxes appeared, such as the window tax and the chimney tax. In England, the window tax was introduced in 1696. The more windows a house had, the more its owner had to pay. The idea was that larger, more luxurious houses would pay more, but in practice, many families bricked up windows to avoid payment, giving rise to entire streets with blinded facades. In Spain, there was a similar levy on chimneys, which led some families to reduce their number or share a single flue for the whole dwelling. Beyond the economic aspect, these measures directly affected health and well-being. Houses with fewer windows were darker and poorly ventilated, and reducing chimneys increased the risk of smoke poisoning. These taxes were not mere fiscal curiosities. They could radically change access to basic resources. The mill toll made bread more expensive, the gabelle increased the cost of preserving food, and taxes on windows and chimneys worsened living conditions. It is no surprise that on several occasions, seemingly small levies lit the spark of great rebellions. In England, for example, the attempt to impose a poll tax, a head tax, in 1381 unleashed the Peasants' Revolt, led by figures such as Wat Tyler. Although the trigger was that specific tax, the uprising channeled decades of frustration over fiscal abuses and feudal oppression. In Castile, excessive charges on the wool trade and the rise in alcabalas, sales taxes, contributed to the Comunidades of Castile in 1520, an urban and peasant rebellion against King Charles I. Although the causes were multiple, fiscal pressure was a key factor. Even in rural regions, fiscal oppression could lead to violence. In the Dauphiné in southeastern France, there were peasant riots over the obligation to pay dues for the use of communal ovens and wine presses, the exclusive property of the feudal lord. In many cases, authorities harshly repressed any protest, but tensions remained latent for generations. These examples show that in the medieval and early modern world, a tax was not just an economic mechanism, it was a constant reminder of who held power. Levies on basic products, control of essential infrastructure, and charges on housing affected everyone, and perceived injustice could turn a small local conflict into a widespread revolt. In the next section, we will set taxes aside to delve into a phenomenon as strange as it is unsettling, an epidemic that did not kill with weapons or disease, but with dance. In the summer of 1518, the city of Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire, was the scene of one of the strangest and most bewildering phenomena in European history, a dancing epidemic. It was not a folk festival or a religious celebration. It was an episode of mass hysteria so intense that some people danced without stopping for days until they collapsed from exhaustion and died. It all began in July of that year when a woman known as Frau Trophea went out into the street and began to dance alone. There was no music, no musicians, no apparent reason. She simply began to move rhythmically, pounding her feet against the cobblestones, and did not stop for hours. The neighbors, bewildered, watched her first with curiosity and then with growing alarm. What was surprising was that, within days, others joined her. First a dozen, then several dozen, and finally, according to the records of the time, between 50 and 400 people were dancing at the same time in the streets of Strasbourg. They could not stop. Some collapsed from exhaustion, others suffered serious injuries to their feet and legs, and there were those who died from heart attacks or strokes brought on by extreme exertion. The municipal documents of Strasbourg confirm the event. Minutes and chronicles indicate that the authorities were as puzzled as the rest of the population. There was no clear explanation, and the initial measures were strange. Instead of stopping the dancing, they decided to facilitate it. Musicians were hired and spaces were set up so that those affected could dance it out. The idea, probably based on the medical beliefs of the time, was that the only way to cure this disease was to let the impulse exhaust itself. In reality, this only made the situation worse. Modern theories about what happened are varied. One of the most discussed is ergot poisoning, a fungus that grows on cereal stored in damp conditions and produces alkaloids similar to LSD. Eating contaminated bread could have caused convulsions, hallucinations, and abnormal behaviors. However, this type of poisoning usually also produces physical symptoms, such as vomiting or gangrene, of which there is no record in 1518. Another theory points to a case of mass hysteria triggered by extreme stress. Strasbourg was going through a period of hunger, disease, and social tensions. In that context, a combination of anxiety, religious beliefs, and community pressure could have generated a massive episode of compulsive behavior. In the mentality of the time, dancing could be seen as a form of trance or spiritual release. A third hypothesis considers that the phenomenon may have been linked to religious rituals or superstitions. Some regions of Central Europe venerated Saint Vitus as a protector against nervous diseases, and there were processions that included dances as a way to ask for his intercession. It is possible that the episode of 1518 began as a misunderstood or uncontrolled ritual act, and then spread uncontrollably. What is certain is that the dancing epidemic was not an isolated fact. Chronicles from the 14th to the 17th centuries record similar episodes in different parts of Central Europe, especially in what are now Germany, France, and the Low Countries. In 1374, for example, a crowd in Aachen began to dance frenetically, spreading the phenomenon to neighboring cities. These outbreaks were sometimes known as choreomanias or dance plagues, and could last weeks. Official reactions varied according to place and time. In some cases, as in Strasbourg, the authorities chose to allow people to dance to exhaustion, hiring musicians to accompany them. In others, religious authorities organized processions and masses to free those affected from supposed demonic possession. There were also cities that banned music and dancing in an attempt to uproot social contagion. In retrospect, the Strasbourg episode became one of the best documented cases of this phenomenon, and at the same time, an unsolved mystery. The chronicles speak of people with expressions of anguish and pain as they danced, unable to stop, which contradicts the idea that it was simply a misunderstood festivity. The epidemic ended as suddenly as it began. After several weeks, the number of those affected decreased and life in the city gradually returned to normal. However, the memory of the event remained etched in collective memory as an example of how, in pre-modern Europe, the boundary between illness, religion, and superstition was blurred. Today, historians see in this episode a window into the mentality of the era, a society that lived under the constant threat of famines, plagues, and wars, and that interpreted human behavior through a spiritual and moral lens. The dancing epidemic of 1518 remains an unsettling reminder that collective behavior can, under the right circumstances, defy all logic, and that at times the authorities' response can be as strange as the problem itself. In the next section, we will explore another aspect of medieval life that, though it sounds grotesque, was as real as the dancing epidemic, the most repugnant and sometimes effective medical remedies of the time. In the Middle Ages, medicine occupied an uncertain territory between superstition, oral tradition, and nascent empirical observation. Without knowledge of bacteria, viruses, or modern chemistry, doctors, surgeons, and healers clung to theories inherited from antiquity and mixed them with religious beliefs. The result was a series of treatments that today seem repulsive, but that, for them, could mean the difference between life and death. One of the most shocking remedies was the use of mummy powder as medicine. From the 12th century onward, the belief spread across Europe that consuming ground fragments of embalmed bodies had curative properties. The origin lay in a linguistic and cultural misunderstanding. The Arabic term mumia originally referred to the bitumen used in embalming, which in Islamic medicine was used as an ointment. In Europe, however, it was interpreted that medicinal power resided in the entire mummy, and soon merchants were importing embalmed bodies, authentic or fake, from Egypt to sell to apothecaries. These mummy powders were prescribed for a surprising variety of ailments: internal hemorrhages, epilepsy, ulcers, and even weakness of the heart. Kings and nobles consumed them, convinced they were ingesting the vital force of the ancients. The trade was so lucrative that at times fake mummies were manufactured, recent corpses treated with bitumen and artificially aged to deceive buyers. Another unsettling remedy was the use of ointments made with human fat. These preparations were used to treat wounds, fractures, or muscle pains. The fat sometimes came from executed people, under the belief that the body of one who had been put to death had special properties, since their life had been cut off violently and their energy still permeated their remains. This idea was part of a broader tradition of cadaveric medicine, where matter from the human body was considered a source of healing power. If this sounds disturbing, the medieval pharmacopoeia did not stop there. Among the most extravagant remedies was scorpion oil. To prepare it, live scorpions were submerged in oil, often olive oil, and left to macerate for weeks. The result was applied to stings, wounds, and even rheumatic ailments. The logic was cure like with like. By using the essence of the animal that caused the harm, its venom was expected to be neutralized. Even more common was the use of human urine in diagnoses and treatments. Uroscopy, the visual examination of urine, was one of the main diagnostic tools of the time. Doctors analyzed its color, smell, and sediments to identify diseases based on the humoral theory inherited from Hippocrates and Galen. But urine was not only used to diagnose, it was also used as a medicinal ingredient. It was believed to cleanse wounds, soothe burns, and serve as a mouthwash to whiten teeth. The presence of ammonia, though unknown to them, meant that some of these uses had a certain basis, although others were mere superstition. Curiously, amid this panorama of unpleasant remedies, some treatments worked, purely by chance. One example is the use of moldy bread on wounds. Some surgeons recommended placing a piece of old mold-covered bread on an infected wound. The original intention had no modern scientific basis, but today we know that certain bread molds produce antibiotic substances such as penicillin. Without knowing it, they were applying one of the principles of modern medicine several centuries before Alexander Fleming isolated penicillin in the 20th century. This combination of superstition, observation, and trial and error defines much of medieval medicine. University-trained doctors worked alongside barber surgeons and rural healers, each with their own recipes and beliefs. Medical treatises of the period included both practical advice and magical instructions, amulets to ward off plague, prayers to stop hemorrhages, and mixtures of herbs with animal and human components. It is important to understand that, for people of the time, these remedies were not macabre, but part of a worldview in which body, soul, and nature were deeply interconnected. Organic matter, including human matter, was seen as bearing energies that could be transferred to restore health. Moreover, the lack of real alternatives meant that, in the face of a serious illness, any possibility of a cure, no matter how strange, would be tried. However, not all treatments were harmless. The use of mummy powders could cause lead or mercury poisoning, present in embalming methods. Applying human fat or scorpion oil could infect wounds rather than cure them. And ingesting urine, far from purifying, could introduce new bacteria into the body. Over the centuries, the advance of the scientific method and anatomy displaced these practices, although some survived surprisingly long. In certain regions of Europe, mummy powders and human fat continued to appear in medical recipe books of the 18th century. Medieval medicine, with all its crudity and strangeness, reminds us that human knowledge is a continuous process, full of failed attempts and accidental discoveries, and that, although certain remedies horrify us today, many of them were born of a genuine will to save lives, even if to do so they had to resort to methods that now seem unthinkable.